Bom, essa é uma aula, na verdade, encerrando o primeiro semestre e preparando o segundo. Então, é uma aula curta de transição de estática para cinemática. A ideia inicial é só mostrar as diferenças óbvias, né, entre uma coisa e outra, um está parado e o outro não está. Dizer que a cinemática é o estudo do movimento, né, sem se importar com as forças que causam esse movimento. Isso faz parte da dinâmica, que é o capítulo seguinte. E para ilustrar um pouco da aplicação de MEC em outras áreas, especificamente aqui na área de educação física, que vocês fazem muito na escola, tem alguns slides, poucos, de biomecânica, com alguns filmes bem interessantes.
A ideia é abrir portas do conhecimento, novas portas abertas, né, nessa aula aqui de transição. Então, começando pela estática. Temos aqui um exemplo de equilíbrio. Somatório de força e momento igual a zero. Vou dar uma empurradinha aqui para ver se o negócio cai. Não caiu, tá firme lá. E agora a cinemática, estudo do movimento sem levar em consideração as forças que causam esse movimento. Observa a biomecânica do movimento. Vamos em frente. Então aqui é um pouco do conceito, o que é a biomecânica, né? É a área de conhecimento que aplica vários conceitos trabalhados aonde? No curso de MEC, olha que beleza. E com a qual todos os aspirantes têm contato lá no DEF, tá? Então, essa é uma ideia do conceito da biomecânica. Olha só, que beleza. Né? E aqui, um pouco do movimento, né, de uma pessoa e uma referência aqui do Instituto Militar de Engenharia, tá? No estudo da análise e dinâmica da marcha humana. Vamos lá. Então, agora, definições em inglês, né? Tem aqui a Sociedade Americana de Biomecânica, fundada em 1977. Aqui tem o link. E agora, só para ficar bonitinho, a gente muda de cor, olha só. Afinal de contas, a aula de estática já foi, agora é cinemática, movimento, mudança. Aí, como curiosidade, vou mostrar duas referências a seguir. Uma delas é sugerida pelo professor Rogério, né, que todo mundo conhece, e que tem interesse nessa área, e acabou que, conversando com ele, também me despertou interesse. Assim, objetivos desse vídeo é tentar despertar interesse em algum de vocês, para quem sabe no futuro a gente fazer um TTC na área de biomecânica. Então aqui é aquela referência apareceu 2 slides anteriores, né, que tinha os garotinho andando lá. Está aqui o resumo do trabalho, as palavras-chave, né, o e-mail da principal autora, e é lá no e-mail onde eu tenho um relativo acesso lá, né, um bom acesso, eu diria, né? Ok? Então, interessai-vos. Vamos lá. Agora aqui vem um filme bastante interessante. Vamos ver se ele começa aqui. Vai começar.
The Biomechanics of Running
Começando.
by Alexis Ma and Aniela Sosnowski. In this video, we will be explaining 3 biomechanical concepts of
Olha
running:
só, ó.
vertical ground reaction force, center of mass, and friction. Let's first take a look at the gait cycle. The gait cycle is used to describe human locomotion. It represents the rhythmic alterations in movement of the lower limbs, the upper limbs, and the trunk that help propel the center of mass of a body in a
Aproveita,
forward
treina pouco de
direction.
inglês também.
One full gait cycle is defined as a time between one foot's contact with the ground and when the same foot touches the ground again. There are 6 different stages of the gait cycle, including heel strike, foot flat, mid stance, heel off, toe off, and mid swing, all which make up a part of one of the 2 major phases of the gait cycle, stance and swing. The gait cycle can be used to describe both walking and running, but let's focus in on the vertical ground reaction forces that occur during the stance phase of running. The ground reaction force is the equal and opposite force that the floor exerts on the body during stance. It is usually measured using a force plate. This graph represents the vertical ground reaction forces that occur during the stance phase of running.
Reação, olha
2
só que
peaks can be seen on
beleza.
this graph. The first peak
Força
is
de
known as the
reação.
impact peak and represents the force that occurs right after heel strike. The bones and joints of the lower limbs are being loaded during the impact peak. The trough between the peaks represents the time at which the runner is transitioning into mid-stance. The second peak is the active peak and represents the point at which the runner is at mid-stance and when he is loading the soft tissue of his lower limbs, such as his muscles, tendons, and ligaments. The shape of the graph and the height of each peak vary based on many different factors. Factors that affect the ground reaction forces in locomotion include one's body mass, the method in which one strikes the ground, footwear, and the slope of the terrain. Let's first take a look at the effects of the type of foot strike on the vertical ground reaction force. In running, there are 3 main types of strikers: rear foot, also known as heel foot, midfoot, and forefoot. As seen in this graph, midfoot and forefoot strikers do not usually have an impact peak. As rear foot strikers have increased forces at impact, there is increased risk of bone injuries, such as stress fractures, as seen in the picture on the left. Midfoot and forefoot strikers usually have exaggerated forces acting during mid-stance, which leads to an increased risk of soft tissue injuries, such as plantar fasciitis and Achilles tendonitis, as seen in the picture on the right. The type of shoe one wears also alters the vertical ground reaction forces acting on the runner. For barefoot runners, the impact peak is higher and more rapid. When shoes are worn, the impact peak decreases and is less rapid, as the shoe is able to dissipate some of the vertical ground reaction forces acting. Minimalist shoes, on the other hand, force the runner to run on their forefoot or midfoot and tend to cause more Achilles tendon injuries. The slope of the terrain also has an effect on the vertical ground reaction forces on the runner, as seen in this graph. When running uphill, the impact peak is decreased, whereas running downhill tends to exaggerate the impact peak. The changes in one's center of mass can also be observed during running.
Olha só.
Center of mass is defined as the point in the body where the mass is equally distributed in all directions. The fundamental mechanical principle of the spring mechanism model can help explain the changes in energy used that occur with the changes in the vertical displacement of the center of mass during running. As seen in the figure, the center of mass moves from a relatively high position to a lower position and then back up to a height similar to where it started. The spring mechanism allows for elastic energy to be stored in the bent legs during the first half of the stance phase, which is then released during the second half of stance. In the first half of stance, energy is being absorbed, as represented in the first half of the U-shaped diagrams for kinetic and potential energy. During this time, kinetic and potential energies are both decreasing as velocity and height of the center of mass decrease. During the second half of stance, both kinetic and potential energies increase, allowing for the preparation for propulsion of the body. The effects of friction are also important in regards to running.
Olha só,
The
fricção,
force of static
capítulo
friction is the
16.
force occurring between two surfaces that are not moving relative to each other, whereas the force of dynamic friction is the force occurring between two surfaces that are moving relative to each other. This equation explains the relationship between the parallelogram reaction force and the maximal static frictional force. If the parallelogram reaction force is less than the maximal force of static friction, then no slipping occurs.
Vamos ver isso
How
lá
is
na
this relevant to
frente.
running, you may ask? Well, if you are running on ice with socks, and if the force of static friction is less than the parallelogram reaction force, you are most likely going to slip and fall. So when Michigan starts to freeze over during the upcoming polar vortex, make sure to wear boots with high traction or to wear clamps on your running sneakers if you are so inclined to run outside. The surfaces of shoes and of the ground affect the coefficients of friction that act during running.
Olha o
An example
coeficiente
of
de
a surface with a
fricção,
low coefficient of
capítulo
friction is
16.
ice, whereas carpet would have a higher coefficient of friction. On the carpet, your tennis shoes would have more traction than they do on ice. This means that the uneven surfaces of both the shoe and the carpet would interact more with one another than do the shoe with the smoother surfaces of the ice. We hope you enjoyed learning about the biomechanics of running with us.
Eu também
Thank you for
espero.
accompanying us to the finish line.
Vamos em frente agora. Ups, como é que eu saio daqui?
The biomechanics of